Hello and welcome to the Majlis podcast, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's current affairs talk show focusing on Central Asia. I'm Bruce Pannier, host of the Majlis and author of the weekly Central Asia and Focused newsletter. Turkmenistan's government has earned some dubious distinctions: enemy of the press, major violator of human rights, the North Korea of Central Asia. Now add to that environmental polluter, specifically super-emitter of methane gas. Satellite images have shown massive emissions of methane gas in Turkmenistan, and international media has reported on this. Turkmen authorities have said they're taking measures, but is it enough to solve the problem? What is the situation with methane gas emissions from Turkmenistan, and how is it affecting the health of the people in the country? To discuss all this, I am joined by Kate Waters, co-founder and executive director at Crude Accountability, an organization dedicated to the protection of the environmental and human rights of people living in the Caspian and Black Sea regions that are impacted by oil and natural gas development. Aynabat Yaylymova, the founder and executive director of Progres Foundation, which works to support various progressive educational initiatives that benefit the public in Turkmenistan, such as soglik.org, which you can find on the internet. That organization has been working to improve public health literacy in Turkmenistan for the past 13 years. Thank you both for joining me. And let me start out by asking you, Kate, can you describe what the situation is with these methane gas leaks in Turkmenistan?
Sure. Thank you so much, Bruce, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. It's an honor, and I'm pleased to be here with Aynabat as well, who has a very unique and just a unique perspective on all of this. So, to talk beginning about the methane emissions in Turkmenistan, as we know, Turkmenistan is the fourth largest natural gas producer in the world. So there's a lot of fossil fuel coming out of that country. It has a small population of 6 million, if you believe the official numbers. But in terms of methane emissions, which are 25% of the global heating that we're experiencing today, Turkmenistan is one of the highest emitters of methane. In 2022, there were 184 of these super-emitter events that you've been talking about or that you mentioned coming from Turkmenistan. And in one of those super-emitter events alone, which was in August of 2022, was the equivalent of emissions from 67 million cars. So kind of, try to imagine that, right? And for such a small country, it's responsible for 1.4% of global methane emissions. And 93% of those emissions are coming from the energy sector. So that gives you, just in very broad strokes, it gives the beginning of the picture of what's happening with methane in Turkmenistan.
Well, let me follow up. I mean, this has been reported in international media. What is the Turkmen government's response to this been?
Well, recently they've started to react. It seems like Serdar Berdimuhamedov is responding a little bit to the pressure. In June of this year, Berdimuhamedov approved measures to improve relevant legislation inside the country and also to enhance collaboration with the United Nations International Methane Emissions Observatory. We'll see what that leads to. I'm sure we'll get into it more in our conversation, but one of the most important things with Turkmenistan, particularly once they sign on to international obligations, of which they have many, is to follow up and make sure that they actually do this. They've also declared that they have put out a roadmap which would pave the way towards their joining the other 150 countries that have signed the Global Methane Pledge to cut methane emissions by 30% by 2030. So the noises are starting to come out of the country, but it remains to see what they're actually going to do. And then from, as an American NGO, one of the things that's very interesting to Crude Accountability and to our partners and colleagues is that the Turkmen government has been having discussions with the United States. We know that Kerry had a conversation with Berdimuhamedov earlier this year, and apparently there's negotiation in the works to start a project that would reduce emissions inside Turkmenistan. Inside Gas reported that this could involve companies like Halliburton or the follow-on to Schlumberger and that possibly even the U.S. Exim Bank would be involved in financing this. We don't know where that's going. We haven't seen anything that's followed up on that, but I think there are a lot of very concerning issues related to that around transparency, accountability, corruption. Those companies themselves have not been particularly clean in terms of their own corrupt activities. So it's something that we definitely need to keep our eyes on.
Okay, thank you. Aynabat, Turkmenistan has already got a reputation of being a polluter in other areas too, right? They've released oil into the Caspian Sea, or at least waste from their oil port, from the port at Turkmenbashi. And this has happened in the interior too. What's the Turkmen government's track record of dealing with issues of environmental contamination? I mean, are there any examples where they've actually worked to stop or curb degradation of the environment?
Thank you, Bruce, for having us and having this important conversation. I see that there's not much reporting happening on this issue. So highlighting and spotlighting this issue is very important for Turkmens and for international community to understand the nuances of working and dealing with government of Turkmenistan. So going back to your question, it's very important to understand that Turkmen media, Turkmen state media, and there's no independent media inside the country that does not report any crises, humanitarian crises, natural disasters that happen inside the country. So an average person who speaks English, Russian, and might have access to internet. And it's important to know that there is an ongoing internet blockade inside the country, meaning that people do not have access to internet at long stretches of time. Like, we're not talking about days, we're talking about weeks. So they get to know this from international media, just from Azat Ligo and from several other sources. So in short, we do not know. The government does not track, report the natural disasters, leaks. Actually, going back to this question of methane emissions, if you talk to an average person inside the country, when they leave the country or while they're inside the country, they have no idea about what methane leaks are and what might be their possible impact on human health, livelihoods, and ecosystems in Turkmenistan.
Do you know what is the effects on human health from methane leaks? Besides the fact we know that it's a superheater, so it's warming, helping to warm up the climate. But what does it do to a person?
Yes, this is so the negative health impacts for local communities that are associated with oil and gas production is not documented in Turkmenistan. There is no research, there's no data to constructively engage on this topic. But it's very well documented internationally in other countries in the region. And I'm sure Kate would have very good examples from her work in Kazakhstan, how it impacts the local communities in Kazakhstan. But we do know that there are health damaging air pollutants. It doesn't matter which country. It might be Texas or it might be Turkmenistan. There are health damaging air pollutants that are emitted alongside methane. So exposure to these pollutants can cause premature birth defects, asthma, and cancer, and many other respiratory and neurological illnesses. So the public in Turkmenistan is vulnerable and is at risk of developing these conditions. They're not only at risk of developing these conditions, working on public health in Turkmenistan for the last 15 years, we keep hearing, it's anecdotal, but these are human lives. We know that there are high rates of cancer. There is no national database to report on cancer, incidence of cancer, oncological diseases inside the country. So the conditions are there. There is no tracking. There is urgent need to study these issues as an international community, as a local NGO, as an international NGO.
Okay, thanks. Kate, what did you learn from research in Kazakhstan about the similar situation to what's happening in Turkmenistan?
Yeah, I mean, methane results in poor air quality, right? So that's one of the first problems, and that can contribute to the formation of ground level ozone. It increases particulate pollution, which we know gets into lungs and can cause lung damage, lung disease, asthma. It's particularly children are particularly vulnerable, as are elderly people, but children are particularly vulnerable to air pollution and to sort of ongoing chronic exposure to toxins in the air, of which methane is one. We've seen this in Kazakhstan, and we have the tragic experience of an entire generation of children growing up around the Karachaganak oil and gas condensate field and experiencing significant health problems, which culminated, we've reported on this widely in this terrible accident that happened in 2014, where we know children ended up even with brain injuries. But the overall problem with the air quality causes problems not only for children, but also for elderly people. As I said, it heightens the risk of stroke. It harms the cardiovascular system. It's very bad for human health, and we also have to understand too that, and I think this is in the case in Turkmenistan as it is in the case in some of the communities in Western Kazakhstan close to the oil and gas fields, where people are heavily reliant on their livestock. They're heavily reliant on gardens that they produce for their own food and their own, kind of especially to get through the winter. And that all of these conditions are harmful not only for humans, but for the animals and plants that we rely on, particularly in rural and underdeveloped areas where people don't have access, to the major grocery store in order to feed their families.
Okay, thank you. Either one of you, but I'll start with Aynabat. How far can these health effects spread? What are we talking about a radius? If you're near a super-emitter spot, how far away do you have to be relatively safe from that? Do we know?
I would defer that to Kate. I wouldn't know the exact radius, so I wouldn't speak about that.
Okay, that's fine. I'm not sure anyone's researched it, but I'm just curious. If this is a problem in Turkmenistan, does it spread to neighboring Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan?
I mean, this is, as Aynabat said in the beginning of the interview, we have very little data and very little information to track this. What we do know is that, when the wind blows and when air moves around, it is possible for there to be impacts that are environmental impacts in communities far away. I can't speak to the specifics of this case with methane, but if we look just, for example, at the situation that's going on currently with fires in Canada, and we see the quality of air in the United States, not just on the West Coast, but all over the U.S., in some cases in extremely dangerous levels of ozone and extremely dangerous levels of particulate matter. We know that there are no borders, right? That there's not a wall that goes up in the air between Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan when we're talking about the natural environment. So this is an impact that it affects all of us, and certainly the causes of methane that are related to global warming and the elevation of temperature, those are not limited to communities just around Turkmenistan. So this is a problem that impacts everyone.
Okay, thanks. And Serdar Berdimuhamed, before he was president, he was at COP26 in Glasgow in 2021. And then after articles started coming out about the methane emissions last year, he actually did speak about it. You mentioned, in fact, that he signed legislation that was aimed at trying to curb some of this. And yet, I think you also said they had one of the biggest emissions that they'd ever had after that. What is the level of international engagement? I mean, clearly this is a problem that affects people outside Turkmenistan. The president has commented on this. Who speaks? Have you seen anyone speaking with him about this problem from the international community? I don't know, the UN, individual countries. Aynabat?
So There periodically the state media and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs covers the issue by meeting with participating with different stakeholders, international stakeholders and international organizations, and the most prominently right now in May and June we're talking about meeting with the U.S. delegation with the United States after the call with Mr. Kerry, the U.S. envoy for climate. So this is kind of this couple last 2 months we're seeing that it's being spotlighted, but the way Turkmenistan's government is acting is more acting. It feels like it's acting as if it's cornered. So it's very important to note that these emissions are not self-reported. These are satellite measurements and data that's been produced by satellite images starting only in 2019. So there is not much information because government doesn't self-report. It participates in reporting to UN structures, but all of them, I can say confidently that all engagement with international community happens with no credible data. And I can speak specifically about the Turkmenistan National Strategy on Climate Change. The country's nationally determined contributions have no credible data, no targets, and no measurable commitments. Just to give you an example, yes, there are political statements of goodwill, but yes, it actually, in most of the cases, if you look at the structure of what's delivered in the state media, it wouldn't have numbers. It would not have confirmation. Yes, we are the big gas producer, but also the big leaker of gas. None of this nature. The statements will not be of this kind of firm acceptance of the problem. Yes, we have a problem here. We need to deal with that. None of this nature comes out in the media. So just to emphasize that, yes, there's a confirmed roadmap for the development of international cooperation aimed at studying the issue of Turkmenistan's accession to the global methane commitment for 23-24. I'm reading the title of this document. This is the title of the document. So Turkmenistan has not signed up for global methane pledge. It's very important to understand that there are no commitments there. This roadmap is going to study the pros and cons, I assume, from as an outsider of making these commitments. So we're talking about there's nothing specific to talk about as of today.
Kate, have you seen any organization or individual country trying to engage with it? I mean, Aynabat listed some, but have you seen anyone trying to engage with the Turkmen government about this issue?
No, not outside of what Aynabat has already spoken about. I mean, the most specific information that we had initially was this engagement with the United States after John Kerry made the phone call, but we don't know anything beyond that. I haven't been able to find any information, for example, about any commitments on either side. And I think it's really important to underscore the points that Aynabat made about the lack of data. We fall repeatedly into this situation with Turkmenistan where the country comes to the table ostensibly to begin a dialogue about an issue of critical concern, in this case, methane emissions and global warming and climate change. And oftentimes I think the response from the international community is like, oh my God, yay, they came to the table. Let's not scare them away. And so there's this sort of snail's pace progress, if any progress at all takes place, where it's almost like that we're grateful they came to the table and that we're engaging with them rather than having standards and holding them to the commitments that they make. I mean, if the country is to sign on to the global methane pledge and cut its emissions by 30% by 2030, that's significant. But what we've seen is a roadmap to pave the way towards them joining the pledge. So I think, we're very far away from something concrete at this stage. And when the absence of data and in the absence of the ability of civil society organizations, independent scholars, those institutions that in the West kind of sometimes push the issue along, particularly when it's politically fraught or when it's complicated. We don't have access to that information coming from inside Turkmenistan because of the brutal regime. So there is no data, and it's extremely risky for anyone on the inside to sort of push this agenda. So I think we need to wait and see what sort of reality comes out of the words that they're saying are their commitment.
Bruce, if I may add to this, Kate reminded me of a recent actually reporting by government of Turkmenistan to several UN structures. So I won't go into details. Several meetings with the Turkmen delegation happened in Geneva. So government reported on elimination of discrimination against women, CEDA committee, universal periodic review, and then the last one that happened last week is the delegation reported to the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. It's very important to note that in all these meetings, the UN emphasized the absence, not the lack, the absence of meaningful data to have a detailed conversation and engagement, constructive engagement on these issues. So it's not just to make it clear that it's Aynabat and Kate are asking this. At this level, at this stage, every UN's meeting, and I'm watching them very closely, it starts with the acknowledging that there is literally that we cannot have a dialogue because there is no data, there's no research, there is no public's access to information. It's also other issues are highlighted, and I will not go into details, but I'll just highlight them, that there's no public participation because the NGOs in Turkmenistan, the civil society sector, the concept of civil society have been liquidated, eradicated in 2003 and 2004. It's impossible to register and operate inside the country as a nonprofit organization. U.S. in its reports, again, it's not just a few private citizens are calling for fiscal transparency. United States in its yearly reports highlights that there is a zero fiscal transparency. The Turkmenistan is the worst performer in terms of corruption in public sector in the region, and then the 10th or 11th worst in the world. And so, so these are the issues that are coming, not specifically being highlighted specifically on methane emissions, but it's coming the United Nations. And why is the United Nations? Because it's the government drives legitimacy from engagement with the United Nations. That's why it's very important to highlight this, I think. Thank you.
Well, thank you. These are good points to make. A reminder, we're talking about super-emitter of methane gas, Turkmenistan, and my guests are Aynabat Yaylymova, founder and executive director of Progres Foundation, which works to support various progressive educational initiatives that benefit the public in Turkmenistan, such as soglik.org, which has been working to improve public health literacy in Turkmenistan over the last 13 years now. And Kate Waters, co-founder and executive director of Crude Accountability, an organization dedicated to the protection of the environment and of environmental and human rights of people living in the Caspian and Black Sea regions that are impacted by oil and natural gas development. First thing, it occurs to me that we've kind of skipped over one of the main parts. Aynabat, I'll start with you on this question. A lot of countries produce oil and gas, right? But they're not super emitters. Turkmenistan is up there with countries like Russia and the United States, which are far bigger than Turkmenistan and have far more automobiles and everything else that's associated with petroleum and natural gas business. What's wrong with Turkmenistan? What's the problem that they're emitting so much of this methane gas?
So little is known about fossil fuel production under Turkmenistan's isolationist authoritarian regime. So according to the experts, there's different understanding of what might be the cause of these leaks. So this methane emissions may be the result of aging old Soviet era equipment, or it might be also there is also understanding that it might be the attempts by the government to avoid scrutiny over flaring. So, as Kate highlighted it at the beginning of our conversation, is that so it's Turkmenistan dominated the top 100 largest super-emitter events from fossil fuels with 70 events in 2022. So we this is a basic information of what might be the cause is not available publicly. There's no study. Just it's very important to emphasize. There's no research. There's no study. So that's why we are approaching the U.S. government's willingness, interest to engage with the government of Turkmenistan with the very first point, request to make the studies and any data from previous period, because the international community started talking about this only now, but I've been living in a gas producing country for many years, right? So there are pre-existing conditions, the understanding of the problem, what is causing, right? Because yes, it's very easy to say that it's Soviet era equipment. Everything is Soviet era equipment in Turkmenistan. It can be power plants, it can be any other area, but we must have some studies and some data that where we can engage constructively on this. And unfortunately, to my understanding, I don't know if Kate has seen it. I haven't seen any studies where the government, participated or was driven or contributed to the report.
Okay, thank you. Kate, in the reports I've read about the methane gas leaks, not just in Turkmenistan but in other places, people are promising that they're going to cut emissions by this much. What does that mean exactly? Understanding they're not going to cut production. What do you need to do to cut methane emissions, and more specifically, perhaps, what isn't Turkmenistan doing that it could and should do to cut methane emissions?
So when we talk about methane emissions, two main sources of emissions. One is intentional venting, right? So especially at fossil fuel facilities, at petroleum facilities. So this is when the company or at the site, they purposely directly release methane into the atmosphere. Oftentimes this is for safety reasons, and it depends that, there's all kinds of regulations that control that. And when there's venting happening, not only is methane coming out, but all other kinds of things too, right? So when we talk about environmental health concerns, there's xylene, there's benzene, there's all other sorts of dangerous things that are coming out. But so it's this venting, this flaring. The second thing is when there are leaks. So some of that, yes, can be old equipment. Some of it is equipment, perhaps. And again, as Aynabat has said, we don't have data from inside Turkmenistan, but we know when equipment is old or when equipment is put together shoddily or it's not maintained, there is leaking there. And so what we know about Turkmenistan is that 46% of oil and gas related methane emissions are the result of venting. We also know that 21% of Turkmenistan's oil and gas related methane emissions are fugitive emissions. And that fugitive emission, that statistic is higher, for example, than it is in Kazakhstan or in Uzbekistan or in Azerbaijan, so the other major oil and gas producing countries in the Central Asian Caucasus region. Why is that? We're not really sure because we don't have the data. But what we do know is that the technology to stop all of this exists. It's not like, oh, this just has to happen. If the Turkmen government were to, as it's, sort of broad strokes talking about, really engage in a serious program to reduce its methane emissions, it's not as if the science isn't there. We know how to do that in this day and age. And so it could be done. And, I just have to mention one other thing, which, perhaps is speculation, but when we look at this situation through the eyes of a country that has decimated its educational system over the last, now, 20 years, and we don't have data. We have to ask the question, is it only because the government is hiding or refusing to gather data? Is it that there isn't the technical capacity anymore within the governmental structures, the appropriate ministries, to actually find and gather and understand the data? Like, where is the problem there? And it's a crisis situation. And until that information is available, it's going to be very difficult to understand how to solve the problem.
Bruce, if may I add just one thing to this? It's so this chronic condition, we have to place this in the context of absence of data. So this is not, we're not dealing here just, okay, this is methane emissions and government doesn't want to release data or provide more information. So I would like just to remind that as of today, we do not have basic statistics on COVID, on infections and death in Turkmenistan. So it's the same. Before COVID, we've been having other conditions, not at pandemic level, but HIV and TB. We do not know anything about the level of a scale of this public health emergencies, because there are emergencies in the region. So, and just going back to census, we don't know the results from the last census, the previous census in 2012, and then the last census 2022. There's a lot of questions. This credibility issue, the data about the data. So none of it is addressed by the government. So one thing that I would like to add to this kind of a list of questions, that very good questions Kate raised. What could that be? Is this lack of political will, or what can that be? There's one more thing that we're observing, based on my experience, is that it's actually incompetency. So it's a grand incompetency, if I can term this, or maybe somebody already termed this concept. In the context of Turkmenistan, we just see that there's not enough people and expertise to engage with international organizations in international projects, and that is a huge problem.
Okay, well then let me ask a question to both of you. We understand that the Turkmen government doesn't seem to be wanting to do anything about this, or is unwilling to confront this problem. And thank you for mentioning COVID, Aynabat, because of course it's worth mentioning too that in Turkmenistan today they still claim that they've never had a single case of COVID. But is there an international mechanism if the Turkmen government is unwilling to confront this problem, which has ramifications beyond Turkmenistan's borders? Is there anything that an international mechanism to kind of compel Turkmenistan to take some kind of action on this? Kate?
I don't think there's an international body that can compel Turkmenistan to comply. There are bodies in which Turkmenistan participates and in which these conversations are reasonable, important, and required to have. The United Nations, International Methane Emissions Observatory is one of those. The Global Methane Pledge, if Turkmenistan is to sign on to it, is an area where perhaps there can be some compliance required. But we also have existing organizations like the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which has its second dimension, which involves environment and economics, and climate falls squarely into that. And, Turkmenistan is a member of the OSCE. And if that institution were to be more robust in its discussion and recommendations to member states about the impacts of climate and what individual and participating states can do to alleviate the problem, perhaps there would be more conversation there. But these are voluntary. This is voluntary participation, really, on the part of Turkmenistan, at least in fact. So I think this is one of the biggest problems, is how do you get someone who isn't interested in really having a sincere and serious conversation, by all appearances, to the table to do exactly that.
Aynabat, you seen any organization called Turkmenistan out on this one? Anybody that stepped up and said, hey, you got, do something about this?
So we do know that the government is very proud of its relationships with the United Nations, right? It's reminds periodically in the state media that we have 17 or so structures, offices of United Nations. We report, we confirm our, commitment to certain things. So you can see that something is worth exploring there. So the United Nations has been very silent, and this is just based on COVID, right? Because it's a tragedy that happened to Turkmens. It's going to be a major trauma in Turkmen psyche. What happened, and of course previous disasters, but this was like at the world level denial of humanity, Turkmen's humanity, by concealing the numbers and facts. So the United Nations stood silent. So I don't know where you can possibly move from that point. Like there were no statements. So there were no statements. There was no calling on the government even in a gentle diplomatic way. So those things are not happening in engagement with Turkmenistan, but there's possibility there. I see that as a possibility there, and I don't know if Kate, do you think it's something might happen under engagement on Aarhus Convention, because Turkmenistan is a signatory signed up to Aarhus Convention in 1999, and it actually was found in a non-compliance with the articles of Aarhus Convention in 2004. So there's some mechanisms, but it should be really at this point a political effort, political will of international community to not to act as business as usual in Turkmenistan, because so far it's business very usual for Turkmenistan. Stay silent, keep it at minimum. Aynabat, we talk behind closed doors. Don't worry, things will happen. It's been 31 years. I'm not sure what you are talking about behind closed doors, but it's only getting worse for civil society. It's nothing. I mean, I don't know if you can even say worse, because earlier I mentioned that it's been liquidated, the civil society in 2004. So groups like ours, we cannot get registered. We cannot work inside the country. There's huge barriers to registration. So, so that's the state of affairs.
Okay, thanks. And we're getting close to the end, so I'm going to give you each a chance to comment on anything you think we haven't touched on during this discussion that's important for our audience to know, or just make some final statement on the situation in Turkmenistan. And Kate, I'll start with you.
Sure. First, I just want to thank you again for the opportunity to be here and to be on with Aynabat on this really important discussion. I mean, I think what this conversation has really underscored is the importance of science. And whether that's citizen science that's done when, governments and other institutions are unwilling, for whatever reason, to gather data, or it's, actual data that's gathered by ministries and gathered by academic institutions. Science is the key here. And if we can use the data that we have, whether that's gathered by scientists outside of Turkmenistan exposing the light, I mean, that's what has caused this to be something that we know about, right, is satellite imagery. That's where I think the hope is here, is that the data and the science is so overwhelming at this point that to deny that methane emissions are bad for all of us, that Turkmenistan has to do its part, that we can't just ignore this little place because it has a wacky leader, or whatever the narrative is that people like to talk about. It's important. And when we can use information, data, science, share that, use the existing mechanisms, that's where the hope lies in this story, I think, if there is any. So I think we continue along that route. We know the way out of this. We know what we have to do. It's just a matter of having the political will and, kind of the guts to go forward and to speak out publicly about what's happening. So again, thank you for the opportunity to be here, Bruce.
Okay, thank you. And Aynabat, you get the last word.
So one thing I think we have not mentioned, and I would like to see more conversation happening on this. So methane drives the climate change. And we know that Turkmenistan is not prepared for the dramatic changes that climate change will bring. In fact, it's actually impacting Turkmen people now. We should not be waiting. We should just be closely observing. But unfortunately, we're observing it just quietly and helplessly, because average temperatures, and this is according to the World Bank study, average temperatures in Turkmenistan are projected to rise by up to 5 Celsius by the 2090s. So we're experiencing high temperatures, dust storms, severe drought, severe water shortages, and all this is having devastating impact on human health and in Turkmenistan. So under high emissions pathways, according to the same World Bank study, the Turkmenistan surface is projected to convert, and I'm quoting, to hyper-arid land cover. So the uninformed and disengaged public, including the most vulnerable groups, children, women, will bear the brunt of continued government inaction and also continued international communities inaction. So I would like to emphasize we need to join Kate's call for more science, more data, and more research, but also to actually include humans of Turkmenistan into this kind of conversation about Turkmenistan being a big gas producer, big emitter of methane, but also how it impacts Turkmenistan, and to think about as an international community how you can a little bit improve the life in Turkmenistan by putting in place transparent and accountable processes. Thank you so much, Bruce, for inviting us. It's wonderful to join your conversation. Thank you, and Kate. It's amazing that we connected here again. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kate, and thank you, Aynabat, for being on the show. It's certainly an important topic. Hopefully, there'll be some positive developments in it, and I can bring you both back on the show again. But for now, we've run out of time. So, thank you both again, and a big thanks as always to Nathan Shoemaker, our Majlis podcast producer in Washington D.C. And a reminder: you can subscribe to the Majlis podcast or the Central Asia in Focus newsletter by visiting Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's website at rfarl.org. Thank you very much, and we'll be back next week. Bye-bye.